Leviticus 23, this is the chapter speaking about the various feasts. Starting here in verse 33, it says, And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, The 15th day of this 7th month shall be the feast of tabernacles for 7 days unto the Lord. On the first day shall be an holy convocation. You shall do no servile work therein. 7 days you shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. On the 8th day shall be an holy convocation unto you, and you shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. It is a solemn assembly, and you shall do no servile work therein. These are the feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, to offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord, a burnt offering and a meat offering, a sacrifice, a drink offering, everything upon his day. Beside the Sabbaths of the Lord, and beside your gifts, and beside all your vows, and beside all your freewill offerings, which you give unto the Lord. Also in the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the fruit of the land, you shall keep a feast unto the Lord 7 days. On the first day shall be a Sabbath, and on the 8th day shall be a Sabbath. And you shall take you on the first day the boughs of goodly trees, branches of palm trees, and the boughs of thick trees, and willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. And you shall keep it a feast unto the Lord 7 days in the year. And it shall be a statute forever in your generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. And you shall dwell in booths 7 days. All that are in Israel, born, shall dwell in booths. And then your generations may know that I made the children of Israel to dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And Moses declared unto the children of Israel the feast of the Lord. Now, this particular feast is the same one that we talked about last Saturday on Christmas Eve. But there's another aspect to this that I wanted to look at tonight. And so this particular feast is the Feast of Tabernacles. That's its more well-known name. But it is also referred to as the Feast of Booths. You see that here in our text. It is also known as the Feast of Ingathering. The Feast of Ingathering. It is known today by its Hebrew name of Sukkot. And this is, if you hear somebody say they're celebrating Sukkot, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, it is not told to us here in the book of Leviticus, but when Moses is speaking about this over in the book of Exodus, 2 times we are told this. In chapter 23, verse 16, it says, The Feast of Ingathering, again the same feast, the Feast of Ingathering, which is in the end of the year. Exodus 34:22, And thou shalt observe the Feast of Weeks of the first fruits of the wheat harvest. And then again, in the Feast of Ingathering at the year's end. And so when Moses was describing this in Exodus twice, he refers to this taking place at the end of the year. Now, obviously, I mean, we read a couple of times here, this was taking in place in the 7th month. Now, this is the Hebrew calendar. It's not the typical calendar that we go by today, but it is, I think, pertinent to us that twice it talks about this being at the year's end. Now, I want to quote Alexander McLaren here. He said, The Israelites seem to have had a double beginning of the year, one in spring, one at the close of harvest. Or it may be only that the year is regarded from the natural point of view, a farmer's year. And then he goes on to say, This feast was at the gathering in of the fruits, which is the natural close of the agricultural year. And so when he says the end of the year there in Exodus, he's not talking about the end of the calendar year. But nevertheless, again, the reason for the feast being at the close of this particular time period, whatever you want to call it, is, I think, very relevant for us even still today. And so this particular feast was one of the 3 annual pilgrimage feasts that Israel had. They had 3 of these every year, and during this particular feast, all the males from the surrounding areas had to go and make their way to Jerusalem. There was a lot of different ways in which this particular feast was celebrated, some of which we read here in the book of Leviticus, and we're not discussing tonight. But nevertheless, he talked about gathering together the various kinds of bowels of the land was the title that was used there in verse 40. They gathered together these 3 different kinds of wood, and they wave these and they use these in their celebrations. We talked about this past Saturday that there was a lighting ceremony that took place during this particular feast. There was a lot of different ways in which this particular feast was celebrated. The booths, something we'll talk about here in just a moment. But it was a multifaceted feast, but it really had 2 main parts. Now, it was celebrated in a variety of ways, but it had 2 main parts, 2 main functions, and both of these main functions are very relevant to what we're talking about tonight. The first one was to remember how God had provided for them in the wilderness, and the second one was to thank God for the harvest. Okay, and so both of these elements were included in the Feast of Ingathering, Booths, Tabernacles, whatever title you want to use for it. And so I want to look at just a couple of things, and I think you can see how it becomes relevant for us on a service like tonight. And so the first thing that it was to do, it was to give praise to God for past provision. To give praise to God for past provision. We read it there in the text. He says, you shall dwell, this is verse 42, you shall dwell in booths 7 days. All that are in Israelites born shall dwell in booths. And he says this, that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel to dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And so one of the main purposes of this particular feast was to remember back to what God did for the Israelites, having led them out of Egyptian slavery. Now, as we just said, this is one of the main functions of the feast. And so this was to help the Israelites to call back, to remember what God had done for them. Now, as I was thinking about this week, you might think the Israelites might not want to remember the wilderness, right? When we think about the wilderness, there's a lot of negative connotations that come to that. You think of all the hardships that they faced. More specifically, you think about all the murmuring, you think about all the judgment from God that they experienced during that particular time period. However, to negate the wilderness experience for the Israelites would be to negate the overwhelming goodness of God. We read in a couple of different places in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 4, it says, thy raiment waxed not old upon thee, neither did thy foot swell, these 40 years. And so for 40 years, God led them through the wilderness without ever their clothes wearing out, without their shoes wearing out. He says your foot didn't swell, without the normal wear and tear from 40 years of wandering through the wilderness. God protected them. God provided for them. Obviously, a couple of verses later, it says, who fed thee in the wilderness with manna, right? They had every day upon their doorstep. They had enough food for them and their family provided divinely for them. They didn't have to go out and rummage for this. They didn't go out to find this food. It was divinely given to them day after day, again, for 40 years. And so you think about and not to mention the fact that they're being led miraculously by the very presence of God by day and by night. Again, the overwhelming goodness of God was something to be seen in the wilderness. And so here, one of the particular reasons for this festival was for the Israelites to call back to that particular time. How would they do that? Well, during this particular 7-day period, they would dwell in booths. Now, these booths, they've taken a lot of shapes over the years. Originally, they were probably just tents, and they were to go out and they were to live in these tents for the 7 days of this feast. Now, even still today, the Orthodox community, they will still make a little, what they call a booth, usually somewhere close to their home. They'll make a little structure. Now, they don't live in it for the 7 days. The way that they typically do this today is they just have to spend some amount of time every day during those 7 days in that particular dwelling. And a lot of different sources that I read said that they kind of require dinner to be eaten in that particular structure. But they have to spend some kind of time in that structure, which only goes to show how these things have been changed and added to over the years, because that's not what the text says. They were to dwell in them for 7 days. That's not what they're doing now. There's a lot of things they're not doing now. But this was, this was a very important aspect. All of this, again, was to call back, to remember the provisions of God in the past. But then there was another aspect to this particular feast. The second function was a thanksgiving to God for their current harvest. A thanksgiving to God for the current harvest. Again, one of the names of this that we read was the Feast of Ingathering. The Feast of Ingathering. This was a harvest feast. In fact, there's a lot of people, you can't prove this scripturally, but there's a lot of people who believe, scholarship, that tends to think that this was an already existing harvest festival that Moses then added onto the booth aspect. That there was a harvest festival that the Israelites already observed, and Moses just basically piggybacked onto that particular harvest and said, we're going to add on to that the booth aspect and remember what God did in the wilderness. Whether that's true or not, and it doesn't really matter one way or the other, whether that's true or not, one of the most important aspects of this was the thinking of God for current provisions. It's not just what he did in the past. That's important, and we need to remember that. But it's also what he's doing now. And so this was obviously a time of great joy at the harvest season. Again, all the hard work that went into producing this harvest, and now that it's starting to produce, it was very appropriate to give thanks and sacrifice to God for the provision of the bounty that he was giving them in this particular harvest. And so one of the aspects of this that we saw a little bit here in Leviticus, there were a number of sacrifices that were to be given to God during this week of this festival. And so again, all of it was to give thanks for what he's doing currently. It was to remember and praise him for what he'd done in the past. But then there's another kind of implicit aspects to this, and this is trust for future provision. And so not only are you praising him for what he's done in the past, you're praising him for what he's doing in the present, but there's also trust and faith for what he's going to do in the future. Again, I mentioned this at the beginning. This was one of the 3 yearly festivals where all the men, all the military-aged men, you could say, were to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Well, obviously, if your entire military is making a trek and placing themselves in one central location, that leaves the rest of the country unguarded, right? That leaves the rest of the country in a precarious situation. I'll quote Matthew Henry here. He said, "But it might be suggested that when all the males from every part of the country had gone up to worship at the place that God should choose, the country would be left exposed to the insults of their neighbors, and what would become of the poor, the women, the children, the sick, the aged that were left at home?" And he says this, trust God with them. And so this was a festival of faith as well. God, we trust that as we send, again, all of our fighting males to go from our homes into Jerusalem, that you're going to protect the ones that were left behind, that you're going to protect those who could not go, that you're going to protect the people who are on the outskirts, who no longer have a military there to provide any kind of aid. However, furthermore, to sacrifice from the first of your harvest shows a faith that God is going to provide enough with what was left in the harvest to provide for whatever you needed, both for you and to sell or whatever it is you needed to make it through the coming season. And so you got to remember that when they're coming and giving their offerings and giving their sacrifices during this particular harvest, the full harvest had not yet come in. They're giving from the first fruits of the harvest. The harvest had just begun to come in. They have not completed it yet. And so to give of the first fruits, to give this particular offering to God, again says, God, I'm going to have complete faith that the rest of the harvest is going to be enough to provide all of the needs that we have as an individual, as a family, as a nation. And so again, we have 3 aspects of this particular feast. We have the praise for the previous provisions. We have the praise for the present provisions. But we also have a trust and faith in God for future provisions. And again, to go back to what we said in Exodus, all of this taking place at the year's end, or the end of this particular time period on the calendar. And so all of this, I think, would lends itself well to a service here at the end of the year. Now, this particular service or feast was the most joyous of the 3 feasts. Even still today, if you ask an Orthodox Jew which is the most joyous, in fact, you could probably ask them what is the most joyous time of the whole year. Most of them will tell you it is the Feast of Sukkot. It is the Feast of Ingathering. It is the Feast of Tabernacles. And it even says there in our text at the end of verse number 41, it says, you shall celebrate it in the 6th month. Again, celebration. This is a joyous time. It says there at the end of, where is it? It says, verse 40, I think it's 41, and you shall keep it a feast unto the Lord 7 days in the year. It shall be a statute forever. Somewhere it says, you shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. I'm just missing it somewhere. But it says it there somewhere in this particular section. I'm just missing it. Nevertheless, somewhere in this particular section, it says, you shall rejoice 7 days. Again, it is a joyous time. It was meant to be. It was designed to be a joyous time. Again, taking all the elements that we've talked about, bringing in the elements of faith, bringing in the elements of praise for the past and for the present. All of this led to an outpouring of celebration by the people, both then and now. And so again, this end-of-year festival, it should have been joyous. It should have been a celebration. It should have been a happy time, because anytime we stop and think about what God has done, joy is the proper response. Joy is the proper response to the working and the goodness of God. And so here we are at the end of another year. Now that seems crazy because it seems like we just began this particular year, but nevertheless, here we are at the very end of 2022. And as we make our way into another year, people are going to go through all the familiar things, New Year's resolutions and all these, and I think those are mainly good. I think you ought to do those kinds of things. But one thing that we need to do, what we need to remember, whenever you're sitting down and you're making your New Year's resolutions, whatever, spend some time and think about the things that God has done for you this year. Think about the things that God has done for you in years past. Give thanks and praise and pray in faith for the things that God's going to do in the years to come. Right? This celebration that God gave to the Jews to do, this pattern to follow is still a good one for us to follow, to give thanks, to give praise for God for the things that He has done for us. And so again, the appropriate thing for us to do is spend some time thinking about the past provisions of God, the present provisions of God, and allow these to give us faith for the future provisions of God. We read in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 8, Jesus Christ the same yesterday and today and forever, meaning what? The same God that the Israelites were worshiping for provision thousands of years ago is the same God providing for you and I today. It is the same God on the throne. It is the same God who gives. It is the same God who loves. And it is the same God who deserves our praise and our joy. And our circumstances do not get to dictate our joy. And so if we're sitting here at the end of another year and think, it was pretty much of a downer year. I don't think there was a whole lot of good that happened. Just open your eyes a little bit. Think about what God's done for you in the past. Think about all the things that He has done for you this year. Think about the fact that you have breath in your lungs, which is nothing more than the grace of a loving God. And there is reason to give God praise. The end of the year is a perfect time to do this. Now, we should be doing this all the time. But the end of the year is a perfect time to do this because this is a time where most people get a little retrospective and start to think about some of the things that have gone on. And so the same God that deserved praise for how He provided in the past is the same God that deserves praise for how He provides today. Because again, He is still on the throne and He is still providing. He has not stopped and He is not going to stop. And so to me, again, I just found it interesting that this one feast, this Feast of Tabernacles, just worked so well to not only give us an interesting topic for a Christmas service, but here again at the end of the year to look at this same feast, this very joyous time that there's so much that we can learn from and so much that we can see from it even still today. Okay. Here's what I want to do now. I'm going to turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. You don't have to turn there, but I just wanted to read a little portion from here. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, which is, interestingly enough, the chapter that we are going to begin this coming Sunday. But at the end of 1 Corinthians 11, Paul deals with communion. Now, as with most things in Corinth, there were a lot of problems with the way that they were doing communion. But nevertheless, Paul gives a piece of advice that, if memory serves me well, I have at least attempted to read every time we've done communion because I think it's this important. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul is speaking here and he says, "Wherefore whosoever shall eat this bread and drink this cup of the Lord unworthily shall be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord." And he says in verse 28, "But let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of that bread and drink of that cup." And so I was actually talking to the boys just a little bit ago and told them that when we come together and we take communion, this is a very important thing, not only because of what it is, but more importantly because of what it represents. It represents what Christ did for us at Calvary. And this is something that we do not need to take flippantly. This is one of the reasons why I don't do it every week. I know a lot of churches do, and I'm not demeaning that. I just think, for me personally, I want it to mean more when we do it. And I think if it's something you do every week, it becomes routine, and over time, routine can mean less. And so I don't want it to become just a routine thing that we do. I want it to mean something every time we do it. And so another thing that becomes interesting about tonight is that here we are in this building that's not the ones that we've been in for me for the past 7 years, for Grace for the past 41. And so what this does then is emphasize for us what the church is, because the church is not a building. The church is a people. And so it is the church that takes communion. It is the people who take communion. And so this is why this one tonight becomes a little bit more unique, I guess, for us as a church, as the people of Grace. And so what I want to do now, and of course for us, we do practice a closed communion, and so everybody is free to stay, but we do try to give this or keep this for members of Grace. Everybody is free to stay, but we do try to give this for members. If you have questions as to why, just come ask me afterwards. We can go over that. But what I want to do right now is just take a few moments just to give everybody an opportunity to pray and to do what Paul just said right here. Let a man examine himself, and then let him eat of that bread and drink of that cup. And so we're going to take just a couple of minutes, let everybody just spend a little bit of time praying and examining themselves.